The alarm pierced through the darkness at 5 a.m., its shrill cry echoing in the small apartment where Marcus had lived for the past 3 years. His hand reached instinctively for the snooze button, as it had every morning for months. But, today, something was different. Today, he remembered the conversation with his mentor, Dr. Sarah Chan, about the override method, a revolutionary approach to conquering mental resistance that would change everything he thought he knew about willpower and self-discipline. Marcus had always been the type of person who started strong but faded quickly. His apartment was a museum of abandoned projects, the dusty guitar in the corner, the unused gym membership card on his desk, the stack of self-help books with bookmarks permanently stationed around Chapter 3. Each represented a moment when mental resistance had won the battle for his attention and commitment. Each was a small defeat that accumulated into a larger pattern of mediocrity. But, today marked the beginning of something different. Today, Marcus would learn that the human brain, despite its incredible complexity, operates on predictable patterns that can be understood, anticipated, and ultimately overridden. The journey ahead would reveal that mental resistance isn't a character flaw or a sign of weakness, it's simply a biological mechanism that can be systematically dismantled and rebuilt in service of our highest aspirations. The first principle Dr. Chen had taught him was deceptively simple. The brain doesn't distinguish between physical and psychological threats when it comes to survival mechanisms. When we attempt to do something difficult, uncomfortable, or unfamiliar, our neural networks interpret this as potential danger and activate the same fight or flight response our ancestors experienced when facing predators. This ancient wiring served humanity well for millions of years, but, in our modern world, it often sabotages our efforts to grow, improve, and achieve meaningful goals. Marcus pulled himself out of bed despite every fiber of his being screaming in protest. His brain immediately began generating excuses. It was too early, he hadn't gotten enough sleep, he could start tomorrow instead. But, now he recognized these thoughts for what they were: not legitimate concerns, but the predictable chatter of a nervous system trying to maintain homeostasis. Understanding this mechanism was the first step in the override method, recognizing that resistance thoughts aren't facts, they're simply data points indicating that the brain perceives a deviation from established patterns. The override method operates on three fundamental principles that Dr. Chen had spent decades researching and refining. The first principle involves understanding the neurological basis of resistance and learning to observe it without being controlled by it. The second principle focuses on strategic implementation techniques that work with, rather than against, our brain's natural tendencies. The third principle encompasses long-term neuroplasticity training that literally rewires our neural pathways to make difficult actions feel increasingly natural and automatic. As Marcus moved through his morning routine, he applied the first technique of the override method, the 5-second rule with neural awareness. When his brain generated a resistance thought, such as "I don't feel like exercising today," he would acknowledge it consciously by saying to himself, "I notice my brain is generating resistance about exercise." Then, instead of arguing with the thought or trying to motivate himself out of it, he would simply count down from 5 and take the first physical action required for his intended behavior. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and his feet were moving toward his workout clothes. This technique works because it interrupts the brain's default resistance pattern before it can build momentum. Neuroscientist research has shown that resistance thoughts, when left unchecked, create cascading neural activity that strengthens with each passing moment. The longer we hesitate, the stronger the resistance becomes. By implementing immediate physical action within 5 seconds, we bypass the brain's opportunity to build a compelling case for avoidance. Marcus had discovered this principle the hard way through years of failed attempts to change his habits. He would wake up with good intentions, then spend 20 minutes in bed mentally debating whether to get up and exercise. During those 20 minutes, his brain would construct elaborate justifications for staying in bed. He was tired, the weather wasn't ideal, he could work out later in the day, one missed day wouldn't matter. By the time he finished this internal negotiation, the resistance had become overwhelming, and he would inevitably choose the path of least resistance. The override method taught him that this internal negotiation was the enemy of progress. Successful people don't have stronger willpower or better motivation, they have better systems for bypassing the negotiation phase entirely. They understand that motivation is unreliable and willpower is a finite resource, so they create automatic behavioral patterns that don't require either. As Marcus laced up his running shoes, he reflected on the second principle of the override method: strategic implementation through environmental design and trigger stacking. Dr. Chen had explained that our environment shapes our behavior more powerfully than our conscious intentions. Most people try to change their habits through pure willpower while leaving their environment completely unchanged. This approach is like trying to eat healthy while keeping the refrigerator stocked with junk food, technically possible, but unnecessarily difficult. The override method requires systematically redesigning your environment to make good choices easier and bad choices harder. Marcus had spent the previous weekend implementing these changes in his apartment. His running shoes now sat directly beside his bed, eliminating the friction of searching for them in the morning. His workout clothes were laid out the night before, removing another decision point that could generate resistance. His coffee maker was programmed to start brewing at 5 a.m., creating a positive anchor that made getting out of bed more appealing. More importantly, he had removed or relocated environmental triggers that supported his old patterns. The television remote was now stored in a drawer rather than on the coffee table. His phone was charged in the kitchen rather than beside his bed, eliminating the temptation to scroll through social media upon waking. These might seem like small changes, but the override method recognizes that behavior change happens through the accumulation of small environmental modifications rather than dramatic willpower-based interventions. The concept of trigger stacking had been particularly revelatory for Marcus. Instead of relying on motivation to exercise, he created a chain of connected behaviors that flowed naturally from one to the next. The trigger sequence went: alarm sounds, feet hit floor, drink pre-prepared glass of water, put on workout clothes, step outside, begin running. Each action in the sequence served as the trigger for the next action, creating momentum that carried him forward even when resistance thoughts arose. Dr. Chen had emphasized that trigger stacking works because it leverages the brain's existing pattern recognition capabilities rather than fighting against them. Our brains are constantly looking for patterns and sequences to automate, which is why we can perform complex behaviors like driving or typing without conscious effort once they become habitual. By deliberately creating beneficial behavioral chains, we can hijack this natural tendency and make positive actions feel as automatic as brushing our teeth. As Marcus began his run through the quiet neighborhood streets, he experienced the third component of the override method: the resistance wave phenomenon. Dr. Chen had warned him about this, the predictable surge of mental and physical discomfort that occurs when we push beyond our comfort zone. The key insight is that resistance comes in waves, not as a steady state. Most people experience the initial wave of resistance and assume it will continue indefinitely, so they stop. In reality, resistance follows a predictable pattern of peaks and valleys, and learning to recognize this pattern is crucial for persistence. During the first mile of his run, Marcus felt the familiar surge of resistance thoughts, his legs felt heavy, his breathing was labored, his brain generated compelling reasons to turn around and go home. But, instead of fighting these sensations, he observed them with curiosity while continuing to move forward. He had learned that resistance thoughts lose their power when we stop treating them as emergencies that require immediate action. The override method teaches us to develop what Dr. Chen called resistance tolerance, the ability to experience discomfort without immediately seeking relief. This capacity is like a muscle that strengthens with practice. Each time we move through resistance rather than avoiding it, we build evidence that we can handle discomfort, which makes future resistance episodes less threatening to our nervous system. Around the 15-minute mark of his run, something remarkable happened. The resistance wave began to subside, replaced by what runners call the second wind, but what the override method recognizes as the natural resolution of the resistance cycle. His breathing steadied, his pace felt more sustainable, and his mind began generating positive thoughts about continuing rather than stopping. This shift wasn't due to improved physical fitness, it was the predictable neurological response that occurs when we persist through the initial resistance wave without surrendering to it. Marcus understood now that most people never experience this transition because they abandon their efforts during the peak of the first resistance wave. They interpret the discomfort as evidence that they're not cut out for the activity, when in reality they're experiencing the normal biological response to stepping outside their comfort zone. The override method reframes this discomfort as a sign of growth rather than a signal to retreat. The second part of Marcus's transformation involved understanding the deeper psychological mechanisms that drive resistance and learning advanced techniques for neural pathway reconstruction. As he settled into his post-run routine, preparing for another day at his consulting job, he reflected on the profound insights Dr. Chen had shared about the relationship between identity and behavior change. Most approaches to habit formation focus on external actions: do this, don't do that, follow this routine, avoid that trigger. The override method recognizes that lasting change requires transformation at the identity level, not just the behavioral level. Our actions are ultimately expressions of who we believe ourselves to be, and attempting to change behavior without addressing underlying identity beliefs is like trying to build a house on an unstable foundation. Marcus had spent years unconsciously reinforcing an identity as someone who starts things but doesn't finish them. Every time he abandoned a project, quit a habit, or chose the easy path, he was providing his brain with evidence that supported this self-concept. The neural pathways associated with this identity had become deeply entrenched through repetition, making it feel true and natural to give up when things became difficult. The override method includes specific techniques for identity reconstruction that work by systematically building evidence for a new self-concept while weakening the neural pathways that support limiting beliefs. The process begins with what Dr. Chen called micro-identity victories, small actions that align with the desired identity rather than dramatic lifestyle changes that are difficult to sustain. For Marcus, this meant redefining himself from someone who tries to exercise to someone who is a runner. The difference might seem semantic, but it has profound psychological implications. When his alarm went off each morning, he wasn't forcing himself to do something foreign to his nature, he was simply doing what runners do. This shift in self-perception made resistance thoughts feel less compelling because giving in to them would require acting inconsistently with his identity. The identity reconstruction process involves three key components: evidence building, narrative reframing, and social reinforcement. Evidence building means consistently taking actions, however small, that support the desired identity. Each completed run, no matter how short or slow, became evidence that Marcus was indeed a runner. His brain couldn't argue with this accumulating evidence, and gradually the new identity began to feel more authentic than the old one. Narrative reframing involves consciously changing the story we tell ourselves about our past experiences and future potential. Instead of viewing his previous failed attempts at habit formation as evidence of weakness, Marcus learned to reframe them as valuable learning experiences that prepared him for eventual success. This wasn't positive thinking or self-deception, it was recognizing that the same events can be interpreted through multiple frameworks, and choosing interpretations that support growth rather than limitation. Dr. Chen had taught him that our brains are constantly creating meaning from our experiences, and this meaning-making process isn't objective or neutral. The stories we tell ourselves about our capabilities become self-fulfilling prophecies because they influence our willingness to persist through difficulty. By consciously choosing empowering narratives, we can literally rewire our neural pathways to support rather than sabotage our goals. Social reinforcement involves strategically surrounding ourselves with people who support and reflect our desired identity rather than our historical patterns. Marcus began spending time with other runners, joining online communities dedicated to fitness, and sharing his progress with friends who encouraged his transformation rather than those who were invested in his old identity. This social component is crucial because humans are inherently tribal creatures whose behavior is strongly influenced by the norms and expectations of their reference groups. The most challenging aspect of Marcus's transformation came 6 weeks into his new routine, when he encountered what Dr. Chen had warned him about: the extinction burst phenomenon. Just when his new habits seemed to be solidifying, he experienced an intense resurgence of resistance that was more powerful than anything he had felt during the initial weeks. For 3 consecutive mornings, getting out of bed felt nearly impossible, and his brain generated more creative and compelling excuses than ever before. This experience would have derailed his previous attempts at change, but the override method had prepared him for this predictable psychological phenomenon. Dr. Chen had explained that when we begin to change established neural pathways, our brain eventually recognizes that the old patterns are being threatened and responds with a last-ditch effort to restore the previous status quo. This neurological immune response is actually a sign that meaningful change is occurring at the deepest level. The extinction burst typically occurs between 4 to 8 weeks after beginning a new habit, and it represents the old neural pathways making their final stand before beginning to weaken permanently. Understanding this timeline is crucial because it prevents us from interpreting the resurgence of resistance as evidence that we're not capable of change. Instead, it becomes a milestone indicating that we're approaching the point where new behaviors will begin to feel more natural than old ones. Marcus navigated this challenging period by applying the advanced override method technique of surfing the resistance storm. Instead of fighting the intense resistance or trying to motivate his way through it, he acknowledged its presence and committed to maintaining his behaviors for just one more day, then one more day after that. This approach prevented him from becoming overwhelmed by the prospect of continuing indefinitely while the resistance felt so intense. The breakthrough came on the fourth day of the extinction burst, when Marcus woke up and noticed that getting out of bed felt slightly easier than it had the day before. The resistance was still present, but it had lost some of its urgency and emotional intensity. Over the following week, the resistance continued to diminish until his morning routine began to feel genuinely automatic rather than forced. This transition marked Marcus's entry into the third phase of the override method, sustainable automaticity and continuous growth. Dr. Chen had explained that once a behavior becomes truly habituated, it requires very little mental energy to maintain, freeing up cognitive resources for tackling new challenges and continued expansion of our capabilities. The final component of Marcus's transformation involved developing what Dr. Chen called resistance immunity, the ability to recognize and neutralize resistance patterns before they could gain psychological momentum. This advanced skill required understanding the subtle early warning signs that resistance was building and implementing intervention strategies at the thought level rather than waiting until the resistance became emotionally overwhelming. Marcus learned to identify his personal resistance triggers, certain times of day when his energy was low, specific situations that activated his old identity patterns, and particular thought patterns that historically led to behavioral regression. By becoming conscious of these triggers, he could implement preventive measures that maintained his forward momentum rather than constantly having to recover from setbacks. The override method's approach to long-term maintenance focuses on continuous skill development rather than rigid adherence to specific routines. Marcus began applying the principles he had learned about running to other areas of his life, his career development, his relationships, his creative pursuits. Each application strengthened his overall resistance tolerance and expanded his identity as someone who could accomplish difficult things. 6 months after that first morning when he had chosen to get out of bed despite the resistance, Marcus found himself living a completely different life. He had run his first 10K race, received a promotion at work after consistently applying the override method to tackle challenging projects, and begun learning to play piano again after years of avoiding it due to fear of failure. The guitar in the corner of his apartment was no longer a symbol of abandoned dreams, it had been joined by sheet music and a practice schedule. The most profound change wasn't in his external circumstances, but in his internal experience of difficulty and resistance. What had once felt like overwhelming psychological barriers now felt like interesting challenges that he was confident in his ability to navigate. The resistance thoughts still arose, the override method doesn't eliminate them, but they no longer had the power to derail his progress or define his identity. Dr. Chen had often said that the goal of the override method isn't to become someone who never experiences resistance, but to become someone who has a healthy and productive relationship with resistance. Resistance becomes a signal that we're growing rather than a signal to retreat. It becomes information rather than intimidation. Marcus understood now that his previous failures weren't due to lack of willpower or motivation, but to lack of understanding about how the brain actually works. He had been trying to change his behavior using strategies that worked against his neurology rather than with it. The override method had given him a systematic approach that leveraged rather than fought his brain's natural tendencies. The transformation extended beyond personal habits into his professional and social relationships. Colleagues began seeking his advice about their own challenges with follow-through and consistency. Friends noticed his increased confidence and reliability. Marcus had become the kind of person who others could count on to do what he said he would do, because he had learned to count on himself. The override method had taught him that the phrase, "the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," wasn't about becoming invulnerable or eliminating all weakness. It was about developing such a strong relationship with growth and difficulty that external challenges became opportunities for further development rather than threats to be avoided. As Marcus reflected on his journey during his morning run through the same neighborhood where he had struggled to complete a single mile just months earlier, he understood that the override method had given him something far more valuable than improved fitness or better habits. It had given him unshakable confidence in his ability to change, grow, and become whoever he decided to become. The resistance thoughts still arose each morning when his alarm sounded, but now they felt like old friends rather than enemy forces. They reminded him that he was continuing to push beyond his comfort zone, continuing to grow, continuing to prove to his brain that he was capable of far more than it initially believed possible. Each morning became another opportunity to strengthen the neural pathways that supported his highest aspirations rather than his lowest impulses. Marcus had learned that the override method isn't just about overcoming resistance, it's about developing such a strong relationship with challenge and discomfort that they become allies in the process of continuous self-creation. The weak self isn't destroyed through force or aggression, but through the patient, consistent building of evidence that we are capable of being exactly who we choose to be. The journey continues each morning at 5 a.m., not because it's easy, but because Marcus has learned that the most meaningful life emerges from our willingness to consistently choose growth over comfort, action over hesitation, and our highest self over our historical patterns. The override method had shown him that this choice is available to everyone, every day, one 5-second decision at a time. In the end, Marcus realized that beating mental resistance isn't about winning a battle against an enemy force, it's about developing the skills, understanding, and identity that make resistance irrelevant. When we know who we are and have systematic methods for expressing that identity through our actions, resistance becomes simply another form of weather that we move through rather than something that stops us in our tracks. The override method had transformed him from someone who was defeated by difficulty into someone who was defined by his response to difficulty. And that transformation, Marcus understood, was the true meaning of becoming indestructible, not because nothing could hurt him, but because nothing could prevent him from continuing to become who he was meant to be.